It all started with a single insult, one reckless act that doomed an entire empire. Cities burned, kingdoms fell, and silence swept across the land. And yet few today realize just how fast an empire that powerful could just vanish. This was the Mongol invasion of Khwarezmia, one of the most devastating campaigns in human history. Welcome to Heroic History, where we relive the most epic wars and turning points that shaped our world every single day. If you love stories of strategy, conquest, and the rise and fall of empires, make sure to subscribe and join our community of history fans. So, how did an empire that stretched from the Caspian to the Hindu Kush collapse in a matter of days? What mistake pushed Genghis Khan from diplomacy to total destruction? And how did a single trade dispute spark a war that reshaped the map of Asia forever? Let's get into it. If you were living in the early 13th century and looked across the Islamic world, you'd probably think the Khwarezmian Empire was untouchable. It was the dominant power in the Eastern Islamic world, stretching across what's now Iran, Afghanistan, and a huge swath of Central Asia. We're talking about an empire covering close to 1 million square miles, controlling key trade routes that connected the Middle East with India and China. It sat right on the crossroads of civilizations, and for a time it looked like nothing could shake its strength. But appearances can be deceiving. On paper, Khwarezmia looked united, prosperous, and powerful. In reality, the empire was hollow at the core, riddled with political rivalries, family feuds, and power struggles that quietly ate away at its foundation. And all of this was happening just as a storm was forming beyond its eastern borders. The man at the top was Shah Allah ad-Din Muhammad II. He carried the title of a great conqueror and commanded one of the largest armies in the region. But he didn't truly rule alone. Real power in Khwarezmia was divided between him and his mother, the formidable Turkan Khatum. Think of it as a dual monarchy, or what historians sometimes call a diarchy. It wasn't a partnership built on harmony. It was more like two captains, steering the same ship in opposite directions. Turkan Khatun was the political heavyweight of the empire. In fact, her official title translated to something like ruler of the world. That's not poetic exaggeration. That was her real title. She had her own palace, her own council, her own bureaucracy. Nothing the Shah decreed was considered valid unless it bore her seal. Imagine trying to run an empire when even your own orders had to be co-signed by your mother. Her influence also extended deep into the military elite, especially the Turk Kipchak nobles, who formed the backbone of Khwarezmia's army. Many of them owed their positions to her patronage. They were loyal to her, not necessarily to the Shah. So when political disagreements broke out, and they often did, those rival factions turned the empire's inner circle into a battlefield of intrigue and mistrust. And as history often shows, that kind of weakness doesn't stay hidden for long. The Shah wasn't just juggling local rebellions and family feuds. He was also locking horns with the most powerful religious figure in the Islamic world, the Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, Anasir. The Caliph technically held spiritual authority over the Muslim world, but by that time, his real political power had shrunk. The Shah, proud and ambitious, had no interest in being anyone's vassal. He wanted to be recognized as a sovereign ruler in his own right, an independent sultan, not a subordinate paying tribute to Baghdad. That defiance didn't sit well with Anasir. The Caliph had long struggled to keep control over his fractious neighbors, and the Shah's open rebellion was an insult he couldn't ignore. But rather than face Khwarezmia's vast armies head-on, Anasir looked east. Rumors started spreading that the Caliph secretly reached out to Genghis Khan himself, whispering in the Mongol ruler's ear to strike Khwarezmia from behind. Whether that story is completely true or not, it tells you just how tense things had gotten. One version of the tale, recorded centuries later, claims that the Caliph's messenger actually had the secret message tattooed onto his scalp. He supposedly shaved his head, let the hair grow back to hide the writing, and then rode through Khwarezmian lands undetected to deliver the message once he reached Mongol territory. Another account says the Kaif tried to sweeten the deal by offering Genghis Khan a group of crusader prisoners as a gift, European knights captured in earlier wars hoping to win his favor. That detail may or may not be true, but it paints a picture of a Middle East so fractured that even Muslim leaders were willing to side with pagans against each other. While all this drama was playing out far to the northeast, Genghis Khan was at a completely different stage of his career. By 1219 he was about 60 years old, an age that for his time was remarkable, and he had already built the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point. He had crushed the Jin dynasty in northern China, defeated the western Jia, and subdued every Mongol and Turk tribe that once roamed free across the steppe. Within a few years, he crushed the Karakitai Kate, which conveniently made him a new neighbor to the Khwarezmian Empire. The historian Juvini described this period as one of absolute peace, security, and tranquility. The same Mongols who once lived as raiders and herders, now ruling a land so peaceful that trade and travel could move across Asia with almost no danger. At this point, Genghis Khan wasn't spoiling for another fight. He had what he needed: land, wealth, and order, and he was smart enough to know that another war would overstretch his forces. So when he looked west toward Khwarezmia, he didn't see an enemy. He saw opportunity. Quite the opposite, actually. He sent envoys to Shah Muhammad II with lavish gifts, silk, silver, precious furs, and a letter written in that poetic, symbolic style Mongol diplomacy was known for. In it, he called himself the ruler of the lands where the sun rises and greeted the Shah as the ruler of the lands where the sun sets. It was a clever way of saying, we each have our own world, let's prosper together. Then came a personal touch. Genghis wrote, I will regard you as my son. Now in the Mongol world, that was actually meant as a sign of respect. It meant, I'll treat you as kin. But to a proud Persianized ruler like Shah Muhammad II, who had just finished telling the Caliph of Baghdad he'd bow to no man, that line probably burned like acid. Still, Genghis made a compelling offer. He explained that his empire was already rich, a mine of silver, he called it, and that he had no reason to seize more land. What he wanted instead was trade, and it made sense. The Silk Road that ran through Khwarezmia was one of the richest commercial arteries on earth. Silk from China, spices from India, silver from Persia. All of it passed through those desert cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, and Nishapur. At first, the Shah didn't trust it. The Mongols had a fearsome reputation, and stories of their brutality had already reached his court. But one of his more level-headed advisors, Mahmud Yalvak, managed to calm things down. Yalvak argued that peace was good business, that both sides could grow rich if they opened their borders to commerce. The Shah hesitated, but eventually agreed. For a brief moment, it actually worked. Caravans moved again between the Mongols and the Khwarezmians. Furs and horses went west, while textiles, spices, and silver flowed east. The Silk Road buzzed with life, and it seemed both empires might finally coexist. But sometimes all it takes is one bad decision to bring everything crashing down. For Khwarezmia, that moment came in the winter of 1218, in a frontier city called Otrar. Otrar sat right on the edge of the Silk Road, where the worlds of the Mongols and Khwarezmians met. It was a busy trade hub, filled with the sound of camel caravans and merchants shouting their prices. And then one day, a massive caravan arrived. About 450 merchants, all Muslims under Mongol protection, carrying gold, silver, silks, and furs worth a small fortune. Then the governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, a man who just so happened to be a relative of Turkan Khatun, the Shah's powerful mother, accused the Mongol merchants of being spies. Maybe he truly suspected them. Or maybe he just saw an opportunity to seize all that gold and silk for himself. Either way, his next move was catastrophic. He ordered the entire caravan killed and their goods confiscated. Now you've got to understand, this wasn't just a case of local corruption. Killing foreign merchants under safe passage was a direct violation of every diplomatic and trade law recognized across the region. To Genghis Khan, it was an insult to the Mongol nation. Genghis Khan wasn't a man easily provoked, but there were a few things he considered sacred, and one of them was the safety of envoys and merchants. He saw them as sacred and inviolable, protected under his own authority as the Great Khan. So, in what was still a moment of restraint, he dispatched a second delegation of 3 envoys, 1 Muslim and 2 Mongols, to Shah Muhammad II. Their mission was clear: to demand justice. They asked for the release of the captured merchants, an explanation for the massacre at Otar, and the punishment of Governor Inalchuck, whose actions had violated every rule of diplomacy and trade. But the Shah made the worst decision of his life. Instead of punishing Inalchuck, he defended him. To him, the Mongol demand felt like an insult, a challenge from a ruler he still viewed as a barbarian from the steppe. Reports from Khwarezmian emissaries who had visited Beijing painted the Mongols as bloodthirsty savages, stories of massacres and devastation from their wars against the Jin dynasty. These exaggerated tales only deepened the Shah's distrust and convinced him that Genghis Khan's offer of friendship was nothing more than a clever trap. And more than anything, it was political survival, not reason, that guided his hand. Inalchuck was part of the powerful Kipchak faction, supported by his mother, Turkan Khatun, and her network of Turk nobles. If Shah Muhammad II moved against him, he'd risk open rebellion from his own army. That's how fragile his rule had become. So instead of justice, the Shah chose pride. He executed one of Genghis Khan's senior envoys and humiliated the others, shaving their beards and sending them home in disgrace. To the Mongols, that was beyond forgiveness. Killing merchants was already a grave insult, but killing envoys, that was a death sentence for an empire. When word of this reached Genghis Khan, he didn't hesitate. He halted his campaign against the Jin dynasty in northern China and turned his gaze west. The man who had once sought peace and trade now prepared for total war. And when the Mongols prepared for war, they didn't just move armies. They moved with information. The Mongols ran one of the most advanced intelligence networks of their age. They didn't rely only on scouts or spies in disguise. They used Muslim merchants who could travel freely between cities without drawing suspicion. These men brought back everything: maps, troop numbers, garrison morale, even local rumors. Armed with that knowledge, Genghis Khan began playing a deeper game. He knew about the rift between Shah Muhammad II and his mother, and he used it like a weapon. His agents circulated forged letters, supposedly signed by one side or the other, claiming a secret alliance with the Mongols. You can imagine what that did to morale. Trust collapsed, and so instead of uniting against the invaders, Khwarezm cities fought alone, each believing reinforcements were coming that never would. Now, in theory, the Shah had numbers on his side. Chroniclers often inflated them, but realistically he could field between 50,000 and 100,000 troops, around 60,000 of them cavalry. It was a mixed force of Turks, Gurids, Khwarezmians, and Kipchaks, the nomadic warriors who also formed much of the empire's nobility. On paper, that's a solid force. In practice, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The Shah didn't trust his own men, especially the Kipchaks, who had strong loyalties to his mother's side of the family. He feared that if he gathered all his troops in one place, those same commanders might turn on him. So instead of uniting his army, he split it up across multiple strongholds. He stationed his main army in Samarkand, the capital, while scattering the rest across the fortified cities of Bukhara, Uttar, and Gurgan. His logic was simple enough. The Mongols were nomads. They lived on horseback, not behind walls. Surely they wouldn't dare attack fortified cities with thick stone defenses and catapults guarding the towers. His own son, Jalal Alin Mangburni, warned him. He begged his father not to divide the army, not to underestimate the Mongols' speed and coordination. But the Shah wouldn't listen. Instead, he trusted those same Kipchak nobles who assured him that once winter came, the Mongols would pack up and head home. They're nomads, they said. They can't handle long campaigns. By spreading his troops thin, the Shah crippled his own mobility. His 40,000 elite cavalrymen, his single greatest strength, were now locked inside separate cities, each one isolated and unable to support the other. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan was doing something no one expected. Instead of taking the easy route through the Zungarian Gate, the most accessible mountain pass into Central Asia, he led his army through the Tian Shan Mountains, a route so dangerous that most people considered it impassable for large forces. When the Mongols emerged from those frozen peaks in the early spring of 1219, they were right on the Khwarezmian frontier, and the Shah had no idea they were coming. Genghis sent a force of about 30,000 men into the Fana Valley, a fertile region known for its trade and farmland. Under the command of his trusted generals, Yoki and Ji, they raided, burned, and looted everything in sight. When the Shah heard the news, he was furious. He quickly gathered his own troops, somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 men, and rushed to confront the invaders. But he didn't realize that what he was chasing wasn't Genghis Khan's main army at all. It was just the vanguard, a small detachment sent to lure him in. The battle that followed near Otar was fierce. The Mongols, though outnumbered and exhausted from their long march, fought with precision. They launched lightning-fast charges, retreated, then struck again from the flanks. They rained arrows on the Khwarezmian lines until chaos set in. By the end of the day, both sides withdrew to their camps. The Khwarezmians thought they had survived the worst of it. But that night, the Mongols simply vanished. They melted into the darkness, slipping deeper into Khwarezmian territory, crossing the Amu Darya River and heading straight for Otar itself. That maneuver was more than a military move. It was symbolic. It marked the moment the Mongols had breached the empire's heartland. Once across the river, Genghis divided his forces. He sent his sons, Chagatai and Ogadei, to lay siege to Otrar, while his eldest son, Joy, advanced toward the city of Gend to block reinforcements. It was a classic pincer move. Cut the empire's defenses off from one another before crushing them piece by piece. Inside Otar, General Inelchuk, the same man who had executed Genghis Khan's merchants and envoys, commanded the garrison. He had a strong defensive position, but morale was crumbling. Supplies were running low, and desertions began to spread. The Mongols, masters of psychological warfare, knew exactly how to exploit that. They spread rumors, sent defectors back into the city with horror stories, and watched as Otar's garrison turned on itself from within. Finally, one of the Shah's officers, General Karacha, snapped. He rode out from the gates with his men and defected to the Mongols, hoping for mercy. But the Mongols despised betrayal, no matter who committed it. Karacha and his officers were executed on the spot. It was a brutal reminder that loyalty meant everything in the Mongol world. As the siege dragged on, desperation set in. A faction inside Otrar finally opened the gates. The Mongols surged in, slaughtering soldiers and civilians alike. Inelchuk and his remaining men retreated to the citadel, where they held out for several more weeks. When it was over, the city lay in ruins. Inelchuk was captured and executed, though how he died is one of history's darker mysteries. Some say Genghis Khan ordered molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a symbolic punishment for his greed. Others say he was simply strangled or trampled beneath horses. Either way, his death marked the beginning of the end for Khwarezmia. After Otrar's fall, the Mongols wasted no time. They turned the ruined city into a base of operations, drawing on its food stores and supplies to fuel their next moves west. At Gend, Yoshi's forces continued the same pattern. Not just fighting, but breaking morale. They sent captured soldiers ahead to spread fear, telling horror stories of what awaited those who resisted. Panic swept through the garrisons. Some soldiers deserted, others switched sides. Across the empire, the Shaw's carefully arranged defenses were crumbling. The troops he'd spread out to protect his cities were now trapped, isolated, and terrified. One by one, those cities would fall, and each fall made the next even easier. Realizing what was happening, Shah Muhammad II fled to Samarkand, hoping to rally what was left of his forces for a final stand. But by then, it was too late. The Mongol storm was already inside his borders, and there was no stopping it. Officially, the Mongol campaign against Khwarezm lasted from 1219 to 1221. But here's what makes it so shocking. The real collapse, the loss of the empire's key cities and central authority, happened in less than 1 week. 1 week. That's all it took for Genghis Khan to turn one of the great urban civilizations of the medieval world into rubble. While part of his army was still busy besieging Otar, Genghis Khan himself led a force of about 30,000 to 50,000 men on what seemed like an impossible mission. He marched straight across the Kazilkum Desert, a stretch of barren, waterless sand no army that size had ever dared to cross. To anyone who knew the terrain, it was unthinkable. But the Mongols were masters of logistics, and this move caught everyone by surprise. Their target was Bukhara, one of the most celebrated cities of the Islamic world, a thriving center of trade, learning, and religion. It stood at the crossroads of Central Asia's Silk Road. But when the Mongols appeared out of the desert, the city was woefully unprepared. Fewer than 20,000 soldiers defended its walls, and they were completely blindsided. The outer defenses fell in just 3 days, by February 10th, 1220. The Turk garrison inside tried a desperate breakout, but they were cut down almost to the last man. The inner citadel held out for less than 2 weeks before it too fell. In under half a month, the pride of Islam had been reduced to ashes. And then came a moment that still echoes through history. Genghis Khan rode personally into the heart of the city, a rare gesture for him, and summoned Bukhara's religious and political elite to the great mosque. Standing beneath the vaulted dome through a translator, he delivered a message that chilled everyone present. He told them, "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." That was psychological warfare at its finest. He was turning their faith against them, framing his invasion as divine justice. For the people of Bukhara, that meant their anger and grief weren't directed at the Mongols, but at their own failed rulers. It was propaganda, and it worked. From there, Genghis Khan pushed west towards Samarkand, the empire's capital. He reached it by March 1220, and just like Bukhara, Samarkand fell with alarming speed. But the Mongols didn't stop at simple conquest. They perfected the grim art of efficiency. In these sieges, at both Samarkand and later Gorgan modern Orient, they used a brutal but devastatingly effective tactic. They forced prisoners of war and captured civilians from earlier battles to work as siege labor or even as human shields. The result was fewer Mongol casualties and an overwhelming sense of helplessness among the defenders. The toughest nut to crack, though, was Guranj, the old capital of Khwarezm. Its walls were massive, and the defenders fought ferociously. Genghis assigned his sons, Yoshi, Chagatai, and Ogedie, to lead the assault together. The city resisted longer than any other, but when it finally fell, the Mongols unleashed one of the most catastrophic acts of destruction in medieval history. They broke the dams that fed the city's irrigation canals, deliberately flooding it. Guranj, once the jewel of the Khwarezmian Empire, was drowned and erased. The Mongols weren't merely conquering, they were erasing the very heart of the Khwarezmian state. The fall of Bukhara and Samarkand shattered the Shah's nerve. Shah Muhammad II, ruler of this once mighty empire, panicked. Instead of organizing a defense, he abandoned his army and fled westward. His empire was collapsing city by city behind him, and his people were losing faith fast. Genghis Khan knew exactly what that meant. As long as the Shah lived, there was still a rallying point, a symbol of resistance. So he sent two of his finest commanders, Jebinoyan and Subutai Batar, to hunt him down. These were legendary tacticians, each commanding fast-moving cavalry units that could cover incredible distances day after day. For months, they pursued the Shah relentlessly across Persia. It was one of the greatest manhunts in history. Finally exhausted and sick, Shah Muhammad took refuge on a small island in the Caspian Sea. Isolated, powerless, and utterly defeated, he died there in December 1220, less than a year after Genghis Khan's main invasion began. And just like that, the central authority of the Khwarezmian Empire was gone. What had taken generations to build collapsed in less than a week between December 27th and January the 2nd after the fall of Transoxiana. The heartland of the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis Khan turned his attention southward. What came next was something historians still call one of the most systematic campaigns of destruction in human history. He gave the job to his youngest son, Tolui, and the orders were simple but chilling. Eliminate resistance in Khorasan. Khorasan was home to some of the richest Silk Road cities ever built. MV Nishapur and Hat were bustling trade hubs filled with merchants, libraries, and scholars. These were places where caravans from China, India, and the Mediterranean all crossed paths. Think of them as medieval equivalents of Hong Kong or Dubai, centers of wealth, culture, and learning. But in 1221, all that ended. Tolui led what can only be described as a scorched earth campaign. City after city was surrounded, starved, stormed, looted, and then completely wiped out. The numbers recorded by Persian chroniclers almost defy belief. At MV, one of the oldest and wealthiest cities in Central Asia, the historian Atamalik Juveni wrote that 1.3 million people were killed at Nishapur. Some later accounts raised that number even higher to 2.4 million. The massacre was so vast that survivors couldn't even describe it in ordinary terms. They used impossible numbers because it was the only way to express the sense of total loss. And it wasn't just lives that were lost. It was knowledge, art, and history. Entire libraries and museums were burned to the ground. Priceless manuscripts, centuries of scholarship turned to ash. When the fires went out, Khorasan was no more. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this one, hit that like button and subscribe. We'll be back tomorrow with another story that shaped our world. See you then.